Just to provide a historical overview as to, what's the catalyst that has led to, or did lead to, the changes being voted on by the Board of Selectmen to the first selectman's salary. Back in 2014, there was a conversation that the Board of Selectmen had really a desire to review the proper structure for the best execution of the HR function. And there was a request and a subsequent study that was facilitated by the Personnel Subcommittee, and there was an outside consultant that was used named Mr. Erdman. So what I'm going to review quickly, just to put into context what that process entailed, was first of all to share what the assignment was of the consultant study with the Personnel Subcommittee, what the approach was, what the recommendations were, the key recommendations and the actions that were taken by both the Personnel Subcommittee and the Board of Selectmen. And then we have available for you just some sample salaries of chief elected and appointed officials of towns that are basically in our size range. So the assignment is on the next page. The assignment that was ultimately put into Mr. Erdman's proposal is the assignment is to examine the roles and responsibilities of the positions involved in the personnel function in the town of Simsbury, Connecticut, and to recommend any appropriate changes in these roles and responsibilities in light of the town charter provision providing for the delegation of the personnel functions to administrative staff. The study recognizes that pursuant to Section 501 of the Charter of the Town of Simsbury, the first selectman serves as the full-time chief executive and chief administrative officer of the town. The recommendations herein are designed to ensure that any changes to the assignment of the personnel functions remains consistent with this mandate. And on the next page, and these are this is the actual wording directly out of the proposal in the study. The second page speaks to what was the approach that Mr. Erdman took under the guidance of the Personnel Subcommittee. The approach to this study has been to have the Director and Deputy Director of Administrative Services complete job content questionnaires, prepare a summary of personnel primary responsibilities, interview the first selectman, the Director and Deputy Director of Administrative Services, conduct a comparative analysis of up to 12 comparative towns, develop a set of draft findings, options, and recommendations, prepare a draft report, review the draft report with the Director of Administrative Services, and make any corrections, deletions, and additions needed, prepare a final draft report, review the final draft report with Personnel Subcommittee of the Board of Selectmen and with the full Board of Selectmen, and submit a final report to the Director of Administrative Services. So those two slides really capture what was the purpose of the study as well as the approach. On the next slide was really just key recommendations and then action taken on the part of the Personnel Subcommittee and the Board of Selectmen. And the first was that there was developed a revised position description for the Director of Administrative Services and identification of an appropriate salary range of $95,000 to $130,000. The action taken on the Personnel Subcommittee was approval of a position description with some changes that were recommended and approved in the Personnel Subcommittee meeting, and then approval of the salary range. The second key recommendation was a revised Deputy Director of Administrative Services job description with a proposed salary range of $65,000 to $100,000 that was approved by the Personnel Subcommittee. The third was creation of an Employee Benefits Coordinator position, including a job description with a proposed salary range of $55,000 to $75,000, and that was approved by the Personnel Subcommittee. And then the fourth was there had been a suggestion in the initial proposal as well as the recommendations that funding for the adjusted salaries could be obtained by reducing the first selectman's salary from $113,850 to $75,000 starting in the next term. And the Board of Selectmen originally approved that suggestion to be effective starting with the 2015 to 2016 budget, and then subsequently changed that to be effective starting with the next term. So that's really the history that led up to the conversation, as well as the two decisions that were made on the part of the Board of Selectmen relative to the first selectman's salary. And the only other thing that we wanted to present to you was just some sample salary comparisons of towns that are in the population range of 18,000 to 29,000. And what you'll see here are listed are some salaries for mayors and first selectmen, as well as chief appointed individuals. And so we wanted to give you the background as enable to put into context as to how the first selectman salary got discussed in the first place. And we wanted to give you some sample comparisons just to help frame any conversations that we have. So with that said, I'll open this up to public audience, and we'll recognize Joan Coe.
Joan Coe, 26 Whitcomb Drive. First of all, Mr. Erdman, as the consultant, did not even look at whether we should have a town manager as a form of government. That was number one. And I asked him when he was here in the hall, because he couldn't talk at the meetings, I asked him why he did not even look at the fact that we needed a town manager, and he was told that he was not to do town manager issue, that he was supposed to just focus on what is in front of him. And I was very upset. He said if he were given that decision, if he were given that choice, he would have looked into it and he would have made a recommendation. So the scope of his study was very limited. That's number one. Number two, we have a charter now that doesn't really give a true job description of the first selectman. You have three people who, once you can delegate, you can talk. This one's in charge. We have no real focus on who makes decisions in our charter. So I would recommend that the first thing you do is, before you decide what the decision is on what the job description is, that you convene a charter revision to revise what you have in the charter, to give focus and direction to the position of first selectman. There is no true focus. And until you have that, you have delegation three ways. And when you have that, you can't run a town. So that is what the choice. Then, after you go through the charter revision and decide how you're going to implement the proposal, then you decide what the salary is. But you're going backwards. You're giving a salary to a position that does not have a job description, that does not have the ability to do anything, and it's just not focused. And we need to have a true definition of what the true job is. Right now it's ceremonial. It could be ceremonial. That's what they had a discussion, and that's what we discussed with Mary. I said to Mary, what did you tell Mr. Erdman? And she said, well, only 5% of my time is spent on town duties, and the rest is political. And from that, that's what you had. So Mr. Erdman wasn't sure, and he said that if it's 5%, then it's 5%. But we don't know whether it's 5%. Mary thought it was 5%, but we didn't know. And until you do the first thing, which is get a charter revision, you can't decide the second thing. You can put out a number, anybody can put out a number, but you truly won't know what the person is supposed to do. So I thank you for listening, and that's what I would get a town manager. That's my position, that's why I'm running for office. But that's up to you to decide what the job description is and what the duties and responsibilities are of the first selectman. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Anyone else who would like to speak? Just please identify your name and address.
My name is Elizabeth Warner. I live on Westcott Road in Simsbury. I'm really here to make one point, which I'll get to in a moment, because I'm among those who was among many who were very upset last December and thought that I should show up today since I was so upset. But I guess not too many people felt that way. Anyway, I appreciate the scope of the study. I think it was the right thing to do as an interim measure while we figure out whether we're going to be a town manager form of government or not. I think it's important to do interim steps. I appreciate that that the board wants to adopt all of the recommendations and that there was an agreement to do that. And that's all good. My only concern is a simple one. Are we, by cutting the salary to $75,000, and I'm going to make the assumption that it's a fair salary for the duties being done. I have no way, I assume that's so. Are we limiting our pool of candidates for that job by doing that? Does it then become a temporary job for someone who, a woman supporting a family on her own, for example? Can she take this? You know, are we limiting the pool? I guess that's all. And I don't know the answer, I just would hope that it would be considered.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Anyone else would like to speak? Tom?
Yes, my name is Thomas Frank. I live at 19 Banbury Drive in West Simsbury. When I first became aware of the discussions relating to a possible reduction in the first selectman's salary, I was a little puzzled by that because I had understood that that reduction was going to be considered because there would be duties that the first selectman was performing that he or she would no longer perform, and therefore he or she would deserve less money. I think that was the thinking behind it. I'm not sure, but that was my understanding. When I heard that, I kind of thought back to my own business background, and having served as a chief executive officer of a well-known U.S. company, I was very aware of what my duties were. And when I did have to deal with administrative activities, that meant there were a lot of things I should have been doing that I couldn't do. And so I had thought that even if our town did beef up its administrative personnel, that would free the so-called chief executive to do other things to benefit the town. And therefore, no salary reduction would be indicated because the chief executive would do other things that would be of value to the town. And so that's his background. I kind of resonate to some of the other comments that have been made that it seems to me it will be kind of difficult to decide what is an appropriate compensation for a chief executive officer of this town unless and until we have a crystal clear understanding of what that chief executive officer is supposed to do. One thing is for sure, that one of the biggest issues in the town of Simsbury is the grand list. And the fact that everybody wants to know, why do we have to pay such high real estate taxes? Well, we pay high real estate taxes because we don't have a lot of a commercial base. I guess that's one reason. And so I would suggest that a chief executive officer, in fact, in a corporation is responsible for business development. And so I would hope that eventually we have either an elected official that has the capability to do business development, which is not entirely likely in all cases, or we eventually have a town manager that is capable of doing strategic business development as well. So I would simply ask the Personnel Subcommittee and the Board of Selectmen to consider those ideas. Let's be absolutely sure, what are we expecting a chief executive officer to do in this town, and then decide what we have to pay in order to get the person to do it.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone else would like to speak in public audience? Okay. Do we need a motion to close the hearing? Okay. I'll entertain a motion to close the hearing.
So moved.
Second. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any against? Motion carries. All right. I'd like to thank everyone who came, and I appreciate the comments of all of you who provided those. And so our next agenda item is to talk about potential possible action that we may or may not want to take relative to this issue in the budget process. Any
Do you
thoughts?
have a recommendation?
Well, our key issue is whether we feel that we will keep the salary as it was currently approved by the Board of Selectmen and would be in Lisa's budget, which is the salary of $113,850 up to the swearing in of the new first selectman, at which point it would become $75,000, or whether there's an alternative, such as wanting to retain it at $113,850 until at what point we do any further review or any consideration of a charter revision. I think those are kind of our two key options.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so as it stands today in the budget that we're going to talk about in an hour, it's as you articulated, Chris, right? It stays at the 113, then it goes to the 75 at the effect of the new term. So, I was hoping for more input this evening in terms of, is it too little, is it too much, and we heard some comments on talent pool, that was a concern of mine back in November. It continues to be a concern of mine, but, I mean, at this point, obviously I'm not hearing an overwhelming need from the community or an outcry to do anything differently with the salary. I think we've had, a fair amount of discussion on this, and I think the public hearing that we have coming up later in the month is really where I think we ought to charge forward with, as you said, figuring out what we're going to do with the government of this town going forward. And is it a town manager? Are we going to further define the scope of the first selectman? I think we need to do that no matter what, personally. Better job description is, do we move the economic development coordinator position back into the first selectman's office from the planning department? There's lots of different ways we could go, all the way town manager, part of the way town, as we've talked about. So, again, I haven't had a single email or phone call on this topic since December. Obviously, I appreciate all three folks that came out to speak tonight, but obviously not exactly a packed house with a mandate to review this any further. This is our shot to do something. Once we approve the budget, that's it, because the charter allows us to change the salary during the budget period. So we have the ability to make a change now, but I'm comfortable with what the first selectman recommended, and that the Board of Selectmen has already acted upon. Is at least my feeling.
I would echo that. I appreciate everybody's comments tonight, and particularly Mr. Frank, on your comments regarding business development, I think is something that as we call for a charter revision, we should carefully consider whether that goes into the job description of the first selectman. Unfortunately, the charter we have to work with now does not delineate that specific, duty for the first selectman. What we have done so far, and we were all in agreement, and including the Board of Selectmen, was make the changes that we thought were necessary to promote a more professional management in the town, and thereby improve our town government by ensuring that we have the very best professional management that we can, and we have ensured for some succession planning in that management structure, which I think is prudent. And I think that we should maintain that because we are very fortunate to have such talented people, doing those jobs. That being said, we took the recommendations of the study for what they were, and we had a great deal of discussion about them in this committee and on the board. And because of the vagueness of the section of the charter that we're working with, which covers the duties of the first selectman, we delegated what we could, but without a specific delegation procedure or a way to divide up those duties into the new position that we've created, or the improved positions that we have, and the increased job descriptions that we've put in our administrative staff. I don't think we can move forward with any changes in what we have now, because we did what both our prior first selectman and our current first selectman wanted us to do, and that was the recommendation. We were all in agreement on that. So I think for us to disagree with our prior and our current first selectman on the salary issue would not be prudent at this point. But I do think that we need to consider those changes in a charter revision. And I think we're going to discuss that at our next public hearing, so, and give the public a chance to comment on that, so.
Yeah. Hopefully that'll be better attended.
All right, so just offering some thoughts as food for thought. If I had been involved in the entire process, I think what I would have proposed that in recognizing that we needed to basically expand the human resource function, to me it wasn't necessarily that we were really reducing the responsibilities of the first selectman, but recognizing that we really needed more resources underneath them to be able to drive those. And I think that was reinforced by the fact that even though we expanded the resources, we did not take accountability away from the first selectman relative to HR duties. I think typically when you do that, when you expand resources underneath a manager, I think it's pretty unusual to actually reduce their salary as a result of that. I mean, typically in salary administration, the number of people you manage, the scope of your responsibilities, salary actually tends to go up in those situations as opposed to down. So I like the idea of that I think we're all pretty confident that we're going to have some further talk in the Charter Revision Commission, and I acknowledge the validity of wanting to wait to that, but there are just two things that I would just raise. One is the charter revision process can be fairly time-consuming.
Yep.
And so if there is a risk, as was spoken tonight, which I do agree, if there is a risk that at $75,000 we basically have the first selectman's salary uncompetitive for that position, we're going to live with the consequences of that for a period of time that's not necessarily a short period of time. The other thing is I actually think that we can make the adjustment in a way that's not going to be incredibly expensive for us this year, because we already, in this current budget cycle, will have the first 5 to 6 months that will be set at the $113,000 salary, and then it will be reduced for the remaining 6 months down to the 75. We're really talking about adding in about another $19,400 to be able to retain or put the salary back at the 113. And I think what that does do is allow us to have a competitive salary in the short term without running risk that we've really made a significant mistake in terms of pegging that salary, or without really a lot of cost impact to the community. And the only other thing I'll add is when I was on the Board of Selectmen before and on the Personnel Subcommittee, we did tend to look at wanting to peg the first selectman's salary reasonably close to what we saw town managers in similar-sized towns earning. And at the 113, I think it's pretty fair to say that we're not really missing the boat on that. If anything, it's still relatively conservative. Mm-hmm. So that would just be my counterpoints for food for thought.
And they're fair points. The challenge we have, Chris, is it frustrates me during the budget process and other times, is we don't run towns like we run business. Obviously, with our retirement system is a perfect example of that. But it's a challenge to try to get those two to marry up. And we had a recommendation from a consultant that that we trusted and implemented most, if not all, of the recommendations. And then the recommendation to move to the 75,000 actually came out of the first selectman's office to the personnel subcommittee, and we didn't debate the validity of that. And I would wonder how we would at this point go back on that. I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just it's what's the other than the competitiveness, I'm not sure of the basis for reconsideration, I guess, and the competitive argument is fair. It's, again, something I raised tonight. It's something I raised back in November. I've talked to some people about the competitive issue, and it is a concern.
But part of that competitive argument was that we were focusing on the competitiveness of our Director of Administrative Services, not necessarily on the first selectman. And that may or may not have been right to do at the time, but because we were increasing the duties of the Director of Administrative Services and the Assistant Director and our new position, we were trying to make those positions competitive, because those are the so-called permanent positions. They're not going to change every 2 years. We are competing in a small talent pool for that. So, not that I disagree with your point, but I think that when we were discussing it, that was more the focus.
Right, yep.
We were more concerned with the competitive nature of our salaried employees, but
Yeah.
not our elected.
Yeah.
So that was, right or wrong, that was where we were going with that. So, again, I think we've, to disagree with our first selectman's recommendations at this point, and she has put it in the budget, as that, and I would.
Didn't go so well when we disagreed with the first one.
Well, yeah, and I would be uncomfortable being,
Although we did technically agree with her, we disagreed
we
on.
did agree with her. There was,
We agreed on the number, not the date. Well,
So-
Yeah, well, I think the spirit of the discussion is, I think everyone, I absolutely think everyone made, and I think there was a lot of consensus around the decision that was made before.
Right.
Yeah.
Although I do think we're free to be able to adjust that and modulate that decision if we want to. The one thing I will say is I do think there is a particular sense of urgency relative to the competitiveness issue.
Yeah.
Because we have an election coming up.
Yep.
And so there are people who are going to be contemplating whether they are interested in running or not. And the salary, as well as the fact that the salary is at risk every 2 years, it is actually a factor that people will take into consideration. I really think there's a lot of people who 75,000 in this community at risk every 2 years, that will be a disincentive for some people who might be interested in running.
I agree.
The other thing I would add is I think the fix to this, which would be short-term because it is going to be re-looked at, is a very inexpensive one, and one that we actually have room in our budget, because we have a wish list that we're going to be talking about that's, in the range of about $100,000 in total. This is a very inexpensive fix to move the salary to something that is competitive immediately without running the risk of undermining a best review of it down the road. And so that's why I would be advocating that even though it's not consistent with what the first selectman's recommendation would be, that it is the right decision and an inexpensive one.
Yeah. No, they're fair points, Chris. Yeah, it's, as we talked about, we never debated the number. The only debate was the timing. And,
Right.
Now we're back to step one. It's, it's interesting. We undid the timing, obviously, for, I think, the right reasons. That we all go all the way back and undo the consultant's recommendation and the prior first selectman's recommendation with the hopes of reviewing this entirely through the charter process. I mean, I think there's some wisdom in it. Again, I've been part of the prior two votes, so it's
Right.
challenging a third time.
well, and the fact that it's a 2-year position is part of the charter review process too. And,
Yeah.
Right.
that's another issue, that if we're really concerned that it's not, that's problematic in finding quality candidates, then we should think about the term.
Right.
Because
Absolutely.
even a quick fix isn't going to solve that problem.
The only other point I'll throw in is when I look at the recommendation of the consultant, it really was always in the context of you could or you may, I think was actually the wording that was used consistently. You may fund these changes by reducing the first selectman's salary. I don't feel it was a hard recommendation consistent with the wording that was used for the other recommendations. And I felt it was really left to the discretion and the best judgment of the Personnel Subcommittee and the Board of Selectmen more than, and I was not involved in the direct discussions with him, so it very well may be that his actual wording was much stronger than the wording that's in the proposals. But when I look at the written proposals, I see them more as a potentiality as opposed to a hard recommendation.
I don't disagree with you, but when he was presenting his findings, he presented it in different options. We had option 1, option 2, option 3, and I think a lot of that was based on the fact that he had presented several options, and he
Right.
was saying, you could do this, you could do this, or you could do this. And a lot of that was based on what happened ahead of that, with the other positions. And as I said, the number was never in question. It was the first selectman and subsequently the board of selectmen who approved the salary number.
Right.
The other challenge, and we talked about this during the hearing, and this is more of memory than anything else, is we talked about the delegation provision, and to be honest with you, while we were talking about it, originally the intent, I believe, was to have the first selectman invoke the delegation provision, which would then have come before the board of selectmen and would have officially delegated the responsibilities. Now, we quasi-did that by creating the additional administrative staff, but the delegation provision was never invoked. So the job description kind of was changed by virtue of, again, passing off duties, but technically the delegation provision was never invoked, and I think that's part of where the 75 came from. Is if you were officially going to be delegating. I agree with you from the corporate side of it, but from the town government side of it, you're doing less work.
Right.
So when you delegate, you're doing less work theoretically, because we deal with scope of work around here, right, and job descriptions that are pretty distinct when people only do what the paper says to do, and whereas the corporate world, you kind of expand to different worlds and you get involved in more. So I think that was a big part of it too, Chris, is we looked at it and said, all right, well, delegation's going to happen. 75,000 kind of makes sense, and whether delegation happened officially or not, it's those responsibilities did get passed down to some extent. So,
And we have created the new positions.
Right.
and then we looked at the
that.
funding mechanism like we do with this budget here, where we feather things in and we find ways to pay for things. And when you look at the spreadsheet that we all looked at during all of the discussion, it was, you're going to fund the benefits position out of the insurance fund for a while, and then it's going to come in out of a closed position out of the finance department, which we're doing now, and that's $65,000. We had 2 raises, which were rightfully given for an increase in responsibilities for 2 town staff, and part of that was going to come out of funding from the reduction in the first
Right.
selectman's salary.
Right.
And
Yeah,
all of that happened.
Yeah.
That all
So-
happened.
And I think you had
It's
a
kind of
key
like what the library just did to us, where they closed the
Yeah.
position out and then they added it back, and now we got to fund it again. But
Yeah, I do think you hit on it, because I saw within the conversation the perception and the assumption that there was a fair amount of work that was actually being delegated with the creation of the new position.
Yep.
And that was directly what justified reducing the salary.
Right.
But to your point, Sean, you actually didn't pick, that was a distinct choice that was not picked with it.
we couldn't pick it. The first selectman's the only one
The
that can
first
invoke
selectman was the only
delegation.
one with the power to delegate officially under the charter. So
Right.
we could not
We can't force
enforce that on the first selectman. But the first selectman, rather than doing that, instigated the salary reduction. And it was, the first selectman's office which produced the chart regarding the benefits, the reduction, the timing, the whole. And so, we were taking our lead from that.
Right.
So it wasn't, like we pulled it out of thin air.
Yeah, yeah.
It was,
No, I agree. There was a lot of, I think there was a lot of group decision-making and group consensus, but it is accurate to say that delegation of responsibility never occurred. And I would have argued at the time that expanding the resources for human resources, to kind of the comment that Tom made, was simply enabling the chief executive to be freed up from administrative tasks and be able to focus more on their key responsibilities. So, well, I'll take one last pitch at it. We're talking about, I think, I believe there's increasingly a recognition that the 75,000 is probably too low and not competitive for the first selectman's salary, even to the extent that we're acknowledging that this is something that we would want looked at down the road. I do think we have an immediate issue with competitiveness in terms of the fact that we have an election coming up and we want to maximize the ability of getting the most talented people who want to run for it. I think we can actually restore back to the full 113, given that it was only going to be implemented halfway through the year, for a very inexpensive, basically $19,400. So that's my last appeal. But I think we've had a good discussion, and if you want to make a motion, I would suggest, now might be a good time to entertain one, unless you have some further thoughts you want to share.
I just want to say, I think we have very talented first selectmen, and both women who have held that seat just prior to us and the current one are extremely capable, and I am not inclined to go against their recommendations in this. And whether or not we decide to revisit this after the charter revision and the refining of the duties, which I think is in order, and I really appreciate those comments to that effect, I would have to go with our current recommendation from the first selectman.
No, you both make really good points. I mean, and again, as I said, for every time we've had this discussion, I've struggled with the competitiveness argument.
I don't disagree with you that it's there.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that, that was not part of what was driving this decision, and
You're right.
I think that, and I'm not disagreeing that it's important. I
Right.
think it is. But for where we are now, I think that we have to stay with, the decision that we made, but.
I tell you what, Chris, I'll meet you halfway on this. I think this is a worthy discussion, so why don't we send it up to the 6th and continue this discussion so that I don't think Lisa would participate. Well, she can participate because it wouldn't necessarily.
It wouldn't affect her current.
It wouldn't affect her, so all 6 of us to have that discussion either later this evening.
Yeah, I think Lisa would probably step out only as.
Yeah, I mean,
someone who
that's her
may-
choice, but,
maybe-
but
The only
I-
issue is if the board is looking for us to make some type of recommendation.
Yeah.
I mean, we can have a motion along the lines of where you may be heading, and certainly the Board of Selectmen can have their own motion later on. We can air these issues later on. The only other thing I know I keep saying the only other thing is I'm never beholden to decisions that are made by previous Board of Selectmen, First Selectmen, and always respect the decisions that are made. But if there's data that emerges that makes me question those, I think it's totally appropriate to modulate those. And I also would not have looked for, and I don't want to speak for Lisa, I would not have expected that she would have been recommending increasing the salary, because it really, I think in her purview, it would have been a decision that really should come from the Personnel Subcommittee.
No, that's fair. That's fair. It's, again, I am a little disappointed. While I appreciate the fact that a couple people came out, I was hoping to hear more on the competitive issue tonight, because it's something that I think, but I don't know. There's no data, and I agree with your concerns, but I don't know. There's 4 of us in this room that have that concern. I'm not sure there's 23,000 people
And I don't know
that concern.
what's the number that makes somebody run for a first selectman, and I don't know what that is.
Well, I mean, the safety is that 113 has worked for a while now, and previous to that, it was 105 or whatever the heck it was before it was increased. Yeah, again, Chris, again, I'll play ball on moving that we have this, we discussed the competitiveness with the rest of the Board of Selectmen, and my recommendation is that we take that into consideration. Again, I know it's not exactly what you're looking for, but, at this point, without further input, I'm not sure I'm ready to stake myself to a different number than I've already voted for.
Right. So what I would suggest is why don't we have a motion to that effect, and that's what we'll share with the Board of Selectmen, and this is a good discussion, and I think the Board of Selectmen, we can share the perspective with the Board of Selectmen.
Okay.
My preference would be to go to them with an actual recommendation coming out of the committee. So if the motion is to stay put where we're at, why don't one of you make that motion, and we'll have a vote.
See, I want to keep talking about it.
Well, and I'm perfectly happy to keep talking about it, but and to that point, Chris, the vote that was taken on the original salary reduction was done by the whole Board of Selectmen.
Right.
We referred that one up to the whole board also, because we felt it was that important. So I think we would be consistent in doing that.
Yep. To that extent, I actually wish I was on the Board of Selectmen during that conversation.
No, you don't.
Oh, no, I actually,
Careful what you
no.
wish for.
Trust me, you don't.
I do, and had there, actually, maybe had there been more kind of dialogue on it, who knows where things would have ended up. But,
Well, and as I said, and that,
we talked about it a lot, but-
the competitive issue was not the issue. We took the number from the first selectman, and
Right.
that's what we approved.
Right.
So, I'm glad we're having this discussion now, because I think it is important. But
I respect that you're asking for a decision, Chris, but I don't think we're going to be able to have a consensus coming out of this. So my recommendation is, and my motion is that we bring this topic to the Board of Selectmen this evening for further discussion around the competitiveness on the current salary of the first selectman.
All right.
That's the best I can do for you.
Okay, so there's no willingness for a motion to preserve it as it is.
I'll second your motion.
Well, there is no motion.
It's a recommendation.
Oh, I
It's a
thought-
recommendation.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you made a motion.
I mean, there's no action. I recommend that we take this to the Board of Selectmen this evening. That's what I'm recommending.
Okay, I do actually want to take something concrete, so I'll actually move that we increase the salary to the 113,850 in total for the next year. I'd rather have that voted down and then go to because I do think there's an expectation that, we have a duty to recommend something concrete. And if we go and we basically say that there was a motion, but it was voted down, and subsequently, that in essence is a de facto keeping it as it is, to me is just from a process point of view, a better process for us than going to the board open-ended. I don't want to impose that on you if you really object to that process.
I do, and without a second, it's not going to
Okay.
it's not even going to get a vote, so.
I would too, only because I feel like this was a discussion we had with the whole board to begin with,
Yeah.
and it should stay there.
And
Okay.
I'm not against it at the end of the day necessarily. I
Yeah.
need to talk about it more. I need to think about it more. So I'm not, at this point, I'm not prepared to vote on it.
Okay. All right. Then, if any other possible action anyone wants to talk about?
No, I think we opened up enough on that one.
All right, then I would move that we have a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I will move that one.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And against? It carries.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Appreciate your
Thank
thoughts.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Good work.
Thanks, Tom.
I wish I was on the board.
Yeah.
Mike, I'm telling you, I wish I was on the
What
board.
are you saying?
If I agree with you, would that be because I wish I didn't?
Thank you.
No, it was a good conversation, really. Yes.
They weren't on the board. Does that mean that you get a reduction in your salary when she gets?
Oh, is that good? Work out all right? Thanks.
No idea what my reduction is. Just a comment.
We can't have it both ways.
It appears from the conversation that there was a very heavy weight placed on the recommendation of the first selectman.
Yes.
Thank you for coming
I
out.
would say, in retrospect, that
Well, thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming down.
Oh, we have the.
Thanks for coming out.